guys, we're going to go ahead and start. I promise it wasn't a trick. There is actually food coming. And it's arepas, which sounds really yummy to me and a little bit different than what we usually have here. So I'll ask for your patience if you don't mind waiting until after the session to pick up your food. And again, I promise it will be that. Wasn't a false bribe to get you here. So I am very excited to have Jimmy Goodrich with me. He works at the Semiconductor Industry Association, managing their global work. And I think Jimmy has been at the center of a lot of things that you guys have seen in the news lately. So very excited to have him here today. We're going to be a little informal. He's not going to do a PowerPoint for you. Instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and tell you about his career because it's interesting. And then a little bit maybe about what's happening with the semiconductor industry now. And then I'm going to ask him some questions to have a little bit of a dialogue. And I'm also going to invite you guys to ask him some questions just about things that are on your mind. So over to you, Jimmy.
Well, great. Well, it's awesome to be here. It's my first time down here at Duke. And I thought maybe I'd come down here for warmer weather. I live in the DC area, but it was 75, 80 degrees over the weekend. So can't really figure out where it's warmer or cooler. And it's awesome to be here with you, Laura, and talk about these topics. I remember talking with you 10 years ago about them when you were working in Asia and in DC in tech policy. So I've been at the Semiconductor Industry Association for about 8 years now. I run our international work, so that's everything related to market access, trade, supply chains, export control. That's a really hot topic. Market research as it pertains to foreign markets. And we have a small team, about 5 people that work on the international side of things. And where it's part of a broader association, we're actually very small. Some of the large trade associations in Washington have 100, 200 people, $500 million budget like pharma. They're the big 800-pound gorilla, but we have 15 people and a $10 million budget, and we like to think we get a lot done with that.
Clearly.
And we actually just passed the Historic CHIPS Act, and that is something that even the larger industries are kind of looking at and saying, oh my gosh, how did this small little trade association ragtag operation manage to get that done? It was actually really geopolitics and the broader environment that pushed that forward.
And he's being modest. It's also because they had Jimmy.
We like to think we had some part in it. But my background actually before coming to SIA was in China and technology and policy. That's really the 3 different tracks that I've been on. It started really as I was an undergraduate student, and actually my major was graphic design. And I decided that's probably a bad idea. And so I switched to international relations, and I studied Mandarin Chinese as my minor. And this was 2003, and that's when China's GDP was growing at 12, 20% a year, at least 2, 3 times faster than what it's growing right now. And it's when China had just joined the WTO, and sort of global industry, commerce, business was awash in sort of the China development opportunity. And I studied Chinese. I actually interned in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing in my senior year and got really engaged in commerce and trade and industry, interacted a lot with business delegations. And previously I was thinking about, international relations, going into the State Department. Never really thought about the whole world of government, business, and trade. And through that internship, really got fascinated in what was going on. And right after college, I worked in Beijing for about 5 years, worked at a nonprofit that does technology policy called the U.S. Information Technology Office. And really there, cut my teeth going in and out of government ministries every day in China for 3 years, working on behalf of companies like Intel, Google, Microsoft, trying to understand how they could navigate this Byzantine network of rules, regulations in a very foreign country to U.S. business. Then I worked for Cisco Systems, doing government affairs and policy in China. We had a very challenging environment there. We're dealing with Huawei, really breathing down our neck in terms of competition. They had stolen our intellectual property. Cybersecurity was becoming a big issue. And then in 2012, I moved back to the States and I worked for a trade association called the Information Technology Industry Council. which is much like where I work SIA now, but it's a broader group. So there's an alphabet soup of trade associations in Washington, D.C. And the tech association, the tech industry has associations for everything. There's one for autonomous driving, for AR, VR, for AI, for the internet, for software, semiconductors, where I work now. And ITI is kind of the clearinghouse. It's every sector all in one. And I did their China policy for 3.5 years. And then it was 2015, and my CEO, who I work for now, was who I worked for previously. He became the CEO of SIA and said, hey, why don't you come along, lead our international operations? And I was like, semiconductors, it's boring. Nobody knows what those are. There's nothing going on in that industry, but what the heck, I'll give it a shot. I haven't really looked back since. That's right when China was becoming a big focus point for the industry. So it really was a passion in international relations and the merging of business regulation and international trade. And there's actually there's a huge career field there. Virtually every corporation, business association, think tank, government agency has analysts, policy managers, research staff, senior executives that are now thinking about this day in, day out. Boardrooms now have to think about geopolitics, the Ukraine crisis, what happens in Taiwan if there's an invasion or an embargo. And so every Fortune 500 company really demands top-notch geopolitical understanding in the boardroom and the C-suite. And that's kind of where I am right now, and sort of that nexus of business, government, and politics.
Okay, that's useful, and I think also useful for this group of students to think about the fact that you now have C-suite thought going into government affairs and public policy work, not just the political risk aspects of it, and also from a legal environment. For those of you who are law students, there are a lot of government affairs teams that run through the general counsel. So, FYI, not always. You don't have to be a lawyer, but
yeah, and the policy teams have folks with a legal background, regulatory, lobbying, international advocacy, and many of the successful business leaders today, the CEOs or C-suite executives, they're not just a business leader. He or she is also an ambassador, really, for their company, dealing with heads of state. Right now, if you're the president of Qualcomm or Intel, they're meeting with the Pope, with President Macron, they're talking with Biden, and they're really actually playing a diplomatic game on top of a business game. And so it's a skill set. A lot of them learn on the job, but they learn closely with this big government affairs department behind them. That's kind of like their consigliere, really behind the scenes, speaking to them in the ear how to talk to politicians.
Yeah, and it probably is a shift since you and I started public policy, right? I know we had a hard time at the beginning of our careers talking to business people about why this was relevant and why it mattered, and now it's kind of front and center.
Yeah, I think the big change is when companies kind of stare down the abyss of the government who's about ready to destroy their business with some sort of regulatory action, and then they really wake up and smell the coffee and start to pay attention to it. If you look back to Microsoft prior to the antitrust case in '97, no presence in Washington. Now they have over 100 people. Google, Facebook, Amazon really been bulking up after a lot of the similar antitrust issues. Export control for my industry, really semiconductors, beyond Intel and Qualcomm having a small presence in Washington. No one had a presence. The association was very light run, but it was the Trump tariffs, Huawei, ZTE. All of a sudden, basically the top 10 list of customers for every semiconductor company was being put under sanctions by the U.S. government. Required, executives to understand China, civil military fusion, human rights, geopolitics, and they need really a full-time department of people to help them do that.
So that's a really good segue to the first question I wanted to ask you about is tell us what happened in the CHIPS Act, and also, because I'm sure these students are curious, tell us a little bit about what it's like to be the guy inside the room when things are happening. What's it like to get that White House phone call?
Yeah, well, I've definitely been keeping a journal, and one of these days I'll publish. Can't do that now. I wouldn't have a job afterwards. Too many interesting discussions, and have been in places like doctors' offices and get a phone call from a cabinet secretary saying they want to talk to you about something. It's pretty neat.
Pretty neat.
And I'd say, right now, the Washington, D.C., but not just Washington, but Beijing, Delhi, Tokyo, Brussels now are very fixated on the strategic importance of semiconductors. And they really understood that through the pandemic. I mean, many of you, if you tried to buy a car or a washer or a dryer, anything electronic during the pandemic, you probably had to wait several months or couldn't buy it at all. That's because there was a shortage of chips. And it's like the oil crisis. Before the oil crisis in the 70s, people thought oil is just this ubiquitous commodity. It's under the ground. You can get it anywhere until you can't. Yeah. Semiconductors were like that too, where they're just everywhere. It's in that microphone. It's in your phone. It's in your laptop, your PC, and with an on-off switch runs on a semiconductor device. And I think we largely took that for granted. One of the first meetings I had with the Obama White House in 2015, we were talking about China's semiconductor plan and how that might be a challenge for the industry. We go in to meet in their in the Situation Room, and I said, "Well, what are semiconductors anyway? It's just a commodity. Who cares where they're made?" We've come a long way since then, and that's really, I think, the challenge with China has highlighted the strategic importance of the industry. There's a sense if Beijing's focused on something, then we should too. That's sort of whether that's right or wrong, that's a mentality in Washington. The shortage, again, really has highlighted how strategic semiconductors are. And then the geopolitical tensions around Taiwan, and I can go into that later. The semiconductor industry is intensely global. It was invented in the United States, the integrated circuit, byproduct of our university system, Bell Labs, invented the integrated circuit. The industry grew out of the care and foster of the defense industrial complex. Early on, companies like Fairchild, Intel, National Semiconductor, their primary customer was the Department of Defense. And this was in the early days of the Cold War, or through the Apollo program, where the government was driving innovation because they had these big budgets and they were asking for things that couldn't be done. Launching a missile from under a submarine, putting a man on the moon. That required a whole new class of electronics. And the industry created them. But then soon they quickly found out that there's this whole other market for things with chips in them. Computers, PCs, laptops. And now the government, as a share of the industry, is only about 1% of revenue. So it kind of grew out of government, the government market, but then it quickly transitioned to a very private sector. And now it's also very global. So the industry today, there's not one company or country that's able to do everything on their own. It requires suppliers that are doing unique gases in Japan, precision equipment in the Netherlands, complex software in the United States, let alone a workforce that's extremely global. I've been in factories for our chip industry in Japan or in Singapore, and there's only one language, it's English, which is the common language, but everyone is from all around the world. For example, when President Biden visited one of the Samsung factories in Korea when he was there earlier this year, there were American and Indian and Dutch engineers giving him briefings on all the equipment he was seeing. I'm not sure if he understood anything that he was getting briefed on because they were talking about chemistry and other things, and that may be a little over his head, but it just goes to show it really takes a village. So it's very global. And it's also research and capital intensive. Semiconductors are the most research intensive industry as a percentage of revenue. About 20% is plowed back into research development. That's as high as pharmaceuticals and second in the ranking, and everyone else is behind us. And then it's the most capital intensive industry. So percentage of revenue going back into things like building chip factories. That's about $20 to $30 billion to build a new factory. So this industry is really complex, incredibly global, and it's also got all different parts. There's 30 different classes of chips, $500 billion in chip sales, 1 trillion chips a year produced all around the world. It's the fourth most traded good, period, globally.
Oh, that's interesting.
$1.9 trillion in
the fourth
trade.
most traded good globally.
The first is it's like refined oil, unprocessed oil, autos, and then semiconductors.
Wow.
Basically
Okay.
that order.
So, so we're seeing lots of things that are interesting. Two things that stand out. One is the reminder that the U.S. has been involved in investment in technologies in the past. So, this is an investment on a scale I'm not sure we've seen before so concretely. And part of the questions I get in my trade and technology classes are, does this mean the U.S. is protectionist? Does it mean the semiconductor industry is protectionist? What does it mean for trade?
Well, the semiconductor industry market is very global. The U.S. is only about 25% of demand for chip sales. And if you look at the different parts of the industry, the materials, the equipment, the gases, the software, different types of chips, memory, analogic, storage chips, everyone depends on global markets for their competitiveness. And it takes a global ecosystem to be built. China is the largest market for chip sales, 36% of revenue. At the same time, the U.S. is a leader in many parts of the industry. So the advanced chip design, every chip that's in your laptop that processes the data and stores it, it's basically a U.S. chip design. Half of the equipment used to produce chips are from U.S. companies. All the bleeding edge AI chips that are in your data centers, powering TikTok algorithms, Tesla's autonomous vehicle algorithm that's being trained, our nation's nuclear weapons, supercomputers, all of that's designed in the United States. But 80% of those chips are built overseas. So we own and control a lot of the design and the IP, but the actual physical production is basically in 3 countries, Taiwan, Korea, and China. Well, countries or regions, however you want to define Taiwan. What I think U.S. government and the policy community has woken up to is that uniquely globalized supply chain works really well until it doesn't. Just like the auto companies struggled with just-in-time inventory. Basically, if you understand the auto industry, their stuff, their parts show up on the factory door the day they produce the car, and it rolls out the same day. That works very nice until there's a big disruption. And so if there were to be a geopolitical disruption or supply chain disruption, just like we saw with the COVID shortage, that would be catastrophic for the U.S. economy. So I think policymakers in the industry have said, all right, this globalized ecosystem, we cannot change it, but we can make it more resilient, and we can do that by investing in more production here in the United States, fortifying our supply chains, but that doesn't mean we're closing the door or we're going to be less dependent on global markets. It just means instead of having, say, 0% of the advanced chip production here in the United States, maybe we can have 10, 15%, so that in the event of a crisis, we'll be more resilient. We'll be able to also attract more investment here, create jobs. It's not trying to do everything on our own. It's not closing our market. And those new factories that'll be built here, like for TSMC in Arizona, Intel in Ohio, those will be exporting all around the world too. In fact, you cannot build a major successful high volume factory without having access to global markets, because the U.S. market's not big enough to sustain that sale or create a return on investment. So the CHIPS and Science Act is really focused on that. And I'm happy to go into the details, what's in it and sort of the different parts and what our role was in trying to get that passed.
Okay, let me ask you another trade question, and then let's go back to that, because I think you guys would like to hear about what's in the CHIPS Act. Yes? Yeah, okay. So the trade issue is interesting. I hear you saying that the semiconductor industry remains dependent even with this investment. But the Biden administration is issuing export controls around semiconductors now. And we even have the ambassador, the U.S. trade representative who's supposed to be out there advocating free trade, kind of saying, well, okay, maybe we're not so free on some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that, I'm curious first because of your China background, whether you think that's a good approach, it's a good strategy, it's definitely targeted at one country. And is the industry concerned about that?
Yeah, so I think there's really 2 threads going on here. One, there's over the last 5 or 7 years, really, during the Trump era, we saw a complete rethink around trade policy. Globalization is really good for a lot of things, but it's also, I think, particularly in the way it has displaced industries in the U.S., like furniture manufacturing in North Carolina, gone. There was a lot of jobs where people now basically, they could be an Uber driver or work at an Amazon fulfillment center. Not really a fulfilling career for some people. And so there was a lot of resentment around globalization, international trade, what that meant for the U.S. workforce. It was manufacturing employment went down. by like 50% from what it was as a percentage of overall employment. In that period, basically 1990s to early 2000s. And that led to a big backlash around hyperglobalization. And I think there's an understanding in the business community as well that we need to do a better job around upskilling, reskilling workforces, redirecting parts of the economy that can no longer compete now that we're in a globalized sector. So there's that thread which is going on, sort of anti-globalization, economic nationalism. And that's not just the United States. We're seeing that obviously in China, Europe, Japan, other parts. Then there's the national security element to it. And that's really around, is the United States in a long-term competition with China? U.S. new Biden administration defense strategy calls it an adversary.
The language is very warlike, right?
Yeah,
it's
certainly
very harsh.
The Trump administration did. And so on the Trump administration, trade drove that tariff war. In fact, I think it kind of drove the Huawei question because it was President Trump's negotiating shit with President Xi over tariffs. Mm-hmm. But really what's driving things now is a pure national security. Nexus, a concern by the U.S. government that China is a long-term competitor. And then the competition hopefully will not be a hot competition, but a cold one around technology and economics. And the most recent export controls, for example, that were released on October 7, the Biden administration believes that by doing so, they can restrict China's advanced artificial intelligence, supercomputing, weapons development, all that kind of activity. And it's 137-page regulation. I've been spending a lot of time up to my ears in it. But it's also very challenging for the business community because now the government is saying some parts of business in China, you just can no longer sell those things. And previously, export controls were something that were limited to very niche type of chips, stuff that goes in spy satellites and bombs. 1% of trade in semiconductors. Stuff that nobody would want any foreign government to have anyways, and they weren't really sold commercially. The controls that were in place in October were much broader. Commercial memory chips or AI chips that could be used for government or commercial applications. The same chip that's going to power DNA sequencing for mRNA vaccine development in China will also power surveillance. And so the government is now moving to restrict that. Some of the companies like NVIDIA announced potential losses up to $500 million. Now, that's 5% of their revenue. It's not make or break, but it's painful. Other companies that are producing some of the capital equipment that were also restricted. So there's a lot of different parts of these rules. They're trying to restrict AI chips, supercomputing, and also China's domestic chip production. We go into China a little bit, what they're doing. But for some of the companies, like one of them, Lam Research, announced it could be $2.5 billion loss or 15% of the revenue they might lose next year. U.S. government is basically saying, we don't care. Cost of strategic competition with China, and that's also completely new. In the past,
it is new. That's right.
It'd be a balance, sort of, take into account business consideration, and now it's national security. Business considerations are second. In fact, one of the senior U.S. government officials that does export control policy 10 days ago said economic considerations aren't even on my radar. We're just purely thinking about national security. And that's a fundamental new game for the business community. That's really challenging, one, to even advocate on these issues. It's, like sticking your head up above the trench and somebody's head might get cut off, but also it is, in some cases, survival strategy for some of the corporations. Very challenging environment right now around export controls, China, supply chains, human rights.
And I think your comment on national security is spot on. That is a dramatic shift in the way trade and policy and technology works in Washington, D.C., and it's dramatic.
Yeah, I'd say, when I was working in China in the early 2000s, in 2010s, the U.S. and multinational companies growing their supply chains, they're hiring thousands, doing more research development, profiting, and then taking that revenue, becoming more successful corporations in the United States. That was seen as in the national interest. It was, from the, President Obama and Bush, Clinton all talked about how that was in our national interest, how that would help China more deeply integrate into the global international trading system. They became a member of the WTO. I think there was a view by some, but not all, that would maybe have China become more like a Western nation. And that's not what happened. I think now people are certainly rethinking that. And those same companies that 5 years ago were doing things that were in the national interest in China are now potentially at complete odds with the U.S. government over national security issues. And companies are have to scramble and readjust and think about their whole business plan and change things 180 degrees as to what they were doing 5 years ago. 5 years ago, companies were opening up big R&D offices. Now they're shutting them down and going to places like India, Vietnam, Canada, Mexico, the U.S. Just talking to one company last night who has 70% of their research, not one of our members, but somebody else, 70% of their research is in China. But all their global customers said, we don't want any of that done in China. And so they said by the end of next year, they will move 50% of their China workforce outside of China. And it's not actually letting that workforce go. They're actually giving visas and physically moving their China research staff into Singapore, Vietnam, US, so they can, smart people, they want to retain them, but they don't want to be physically inside China, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we're definitely going to talk about that more in the China technology class, but for this session, you guys want to hear what is in the CHIPS Act, right? You want a little summary? So maybe we can talk a bit about the content there, and maybe then also do a comparison to China if folks are interested. And then I will open the floor to you guys for questions, okay?
Sure. So, the CHIPS and Science Act is really a historic piece of legislation. It's, on a net basis, the largest U.S. industrial policy investment since the Apollo program, perhaps even equal to the Manhattan Project in terms of scale. The entire Commerce Department budget is like $7 billion on an annual basis. This is $54 billion for the Commerce Department. So the scale of it is huge. And the ambition is also very, very, very significant. The goal of it is really to onshore new chip production, bolster our capability in chip research development, and foster a more competitive workforce. The reality is that the global semiconductor industry, while we have sort of free market economics that dominate here in the United States, and it works very well for most of our industries, in strategic sectors outside our borders, it's not a free market. In fact, there was a study by the OECD that found that virtually every semiconductor facility in the world has significant government support when it's built. If you go to Korea, Singapore, Germany, Israel, Ireland, they're offering tax incentives, 5-year tax holiday, or in the case of Singapore, blank check. Whatever you need, they'll give it to you to put that facility there. And so as a result, all that manufacturing had grown overseas and not in the United States, because at the federal level, the U.S. government, up until now, has offered nothing more for chip manufacturing. So in order to level playing field, that CHIPS and Science Act was developed. So it's $54 billion in grants that the Commerce Department will administer. It will have $39 billion is focused on chip manufacturing, and those will be grants given to companies, both domestic and foreign. So Taiwanese, Korean companies are participating in this too. The sense is we shouldn't just focus just on U.S. companies. It's a global ecosystem. We should attract the best firms possible. There are prohibitions. I'll get into that later. So there's $39 billion to attract new manufacturing lines. And then there's $11 billion for research and development and about $1 billion for workforce and some international diplomacy efforts. And then on top of the 54, there is a 25% investment tax credit, which means that if you are investing in chip manufacturing, purchasing equipment, materials, buying buildings, you'll get 25 cents on the dollar back from the Treasury Department. Be a pretty big tax return check. Some of those will get. It's based on how much you spend. So if you make an investment, you get dollars back. So the Congress scored that at $22 billion. So if you take the 54 plus 22, that's probably a modest estimate. 22, it's probably more like $75-90 billion in total
Wow, so
taxpayer
Almost $1
investment.
trillion.
Almost 100 billion. Yeah, it's a major investment, and that's probably going to catalyze around $200-300 billion of private sector investment. Micron announced a $100 billion investment in upstate New York out of Syracuse to build a massive new memory chip complex. Intel, $20 billion in Ohio. TSMC is $15 billion in Arizona. And those are going to continue to stack up. And there's going to be more and more. Samsung is building one in Austin. They're from South Korea. So there's a lot of excitement around it. There's also an attempt to build a national semiconductor technology center, like a big national research lab that's doing the most cutting edge research. There's a number of proposals around that. And it's a lot of work, but it's going to take really, at the end of the day, the Commerce Department to hire the right people who understand the industry but aren't captive to the industry, because they have to make the decision that's in the interest of the nation and taxpayers. Not necessarily companies' considerations are important, but they have to not just take those into account. And so they're actually creating a CHIPS office in the Commerce Department. There's a steering committee in the White House that's been set up. And they hope to, right now there's 5 different regulatory rule-making processes underway. They're going to issue a request for grant applicants probably by February. So there's a lot of work being underdone. There's also, on the trade subject, conditions. So if you receive a grant or a tax credit from the federal government, there's called guardrails on that. You can't use the grant or the tax credit for corporate buybacks. Facilities have to be built in the United States. You have to do workforce and university partnerships to ensure there's the right workforce training, but also diversity inclusion is important. That's an element of the grant program assessments. But then it says you can't build anything in China. It's a condition of taking funding.
So just China that is excluded?
And countries of concern, that's a code word for China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, that club. And then it's not just all factories, though. It's called advanced production. So anything below 28 nanometer is prohibited. And then any new facilities basically have to get permission. And that's going to be challenging because some of the companies, like those from South Korea, who've already announced major investments in the United States, also have huge production facilities in China. And so do they take the funding and then somehow put at risk 40% of their current production, which is in China? That's a huge debacle right now, particularly for firms from South Korea. That's a big challenge for them. But the rules still haven't been fully written. And it's created a little bit of anxiety, frankly, among some of the U.S. allies because U.S. chip companies don't have much chip production in China. It's Taiwanese and Korean firms that do. So sort of like okay to say for U.S. companies, but we want allies to be here. And that whole balance of wanting support from allies on a lot of different things, from export control to human rights, and then we say you can't take the money here because we have the China factories. That's also ongoing right now with the Inflation Reduction Act around the battery subsidy, which says you can't get a tax credit for an electric vehicle without domestically produced batteries. It's a blatant violation of the WTO. And it royally screws over South Korean and Japanese companies. And if you follow the rhetoric in Seoul and Tokyo, it's pretty heated right now over that. So there's a lot of anxiety, I think, with allies too. Sort of is the U.S. closing the drawbridge? Are they giving up on free trade? I think that's not the case. Absolutely, we're
That
not.
question has been asked for the previous administration, and there was hope that this administration would shift, and it's clearly not, actually. So
I think on China, honestly, that door has kind of shut for the time being. It's, the Washington policymakers look at, it's been a remarkable shift. Everyone is in Washington, the think tank and Congress, Capitol Hill administration, is trying to out-China hawk each other to be the most China hawkish person. And frankly, in some cases, it's not very healthy. Some of the discussions around hype and exaggeration can get really out of control. But at the same time, I think people are watching, Beijing and the 20th Party Congress and Xi Jinping the third term and stressing national security and, visiting, their military command center yesterday and saying, prepare for war. I mean, so that is definitely making people nervous, not just in government, but also in the business community. So, it's understandable that there's going to be a reset on trade policy with China.
Okay, so I have more questions, of course, but I want to give the students an opportunity to ask questions. So you guys raise your hand, and why don't you tell Jimmy what school you're in, what you're studying, and then ask your question. Who's first? I saw some yeses earlier. People who want to ask questions. Okay.
Thanks for taking time out today. My name is Rani from San Francisco. I'm just curious about the next wave of edge computing that is coming together and what portion of this investment caters to that kind of chip manufacturing and how this trade competition really plays out into edge computing.
So if you think about it, with the edge is basically all of the different peripherals that you're using. Your smart watch, smart device, your car now has more and more electronics in it. It's digitally connected. You have 5G communications. You have Wi-Fi. Your medical devices are all Wi-Fi enabled. They're going to be LTE 5G enabled. And what those need are not the most powerful chips, but energy efficient chips that are able to process a lot of data and store them without actually sucking up a lot of the battery power. That's important if you have an electric vehicle, or if you have a phone or a medical device. So that's what kind of sometimes called the Internet of Things or edge network, basically in those terms. But the chips that are in those generally don't require the most advanced manufacturing technology. They're using what we call mature process technology. So the most advanced chips, 3 nanometer today, have around 40,000. Have one transistor that's about 40,000 times smaller than a human hair. And on one chip, there'll probably be about 90 billion of them, like in the Apple M2 processor. It's really incredible. It's insane, really. The technologies in the edge and the type of peripherals we're talking about are generally built on 20, 16, 40 nanometer technology, stuff that's built maybe 10, 20 years ago, but still very relevant from a market perspective. And actually, the CHIPS Act includes $2 billion in funding for mature technologies at those nodes. And the Commerce Department has also said that, particularly for autos and the edge, they want more of that production here. Michigan was Senator Peters and Governor Whitmer were big supporters of the CHIPS Act because the auto companies like Ford, GM, they want more chip production because not many firms are investing in that older technology. It's less profitable. And so that's where there's a shortage, and it's actually persistent. Even right now, there's a downturn in the market. The shortage in legacy chips is still actually ongoing. So there's actually been a focus, but there's a real challenge in figuring out who's actually going to build those lower return on investment facilities. Right now, they're all being built in China, every single one of them, at like a very blistering pace. So if we don't get things right 5 or 10 years down the road, we'll actually be more dependent on China and Taiwan for legacy chip production, while we'll be much better off on the advanced side. And we kind of checkmate, still balanced out. It's really unclear. It's a great question. There's also a lot of design innovation that goes into those chips. Increasingly, people are putting, for example, temperature sensors or heart rate monitors. Those kind of really interesting devices requires engineers who have knowledge about health and science around. All of a sudden, Apple is having to work with some of the chip companies to get FDA approval for their electronics because it's an actual medical device. So that it's really interesting where that then brings in the regulatory side and policy side too. Or, for example, now it's mandatory in most states that cars have a rear view camera as a condition being sold. That's a semiconductor that's in every car that does that. That's a U.S. company on semiconductor that builds like half of those. And they're also going to be building a new facility in the States. So I think, that's a great question. And so it's a priority, but still a long-term challenge. And in some areas, it might require friendshoring. So working with allies and partners like in Singapore, Malaysia, India, where they might have a different cost structure. might be able to do those less profitable parts of the industry, still very profitable, but relatively speaking. The average gross margins for like a big company like in NVIDIA or Analog Devices is like 70%, but for the trailing edge stuff, it's probably about half of that. So still 30-40% gross margin profitability, but that's half of what the I think friendshoring is the area where to watch for, who can actually help us in that trailing edge.
Do you guys
capacity
understand that, friendshoring? Do you know what that is?
Yeah, so friendshoring is, there is onshoring, which is trying to bring production back into the United States. And then friendshoring is if we can't do it, then which of the less geopolitically unstable allied partner nations would be suitable for that? And that's where the U.S. is, like, for example, talking with Malaysia on workforce training for semiconductor assembly and test. They're right now in really active discussions with India around what they can do in semiconductor materials and rare earth processing. Or, for example, the raw silicon, the sand, is actually a lot coming from Brazil and Norway. So, we can't do it all, but maybe our friends can help do some of that with us, and collectively together we can create a network and be much more resilient against future shocks to the supply chain. I think there's a deep understanding in the industry that the U.S. can't do this all on its own.
It's an interesting concept I've heard in the data area recently. So,
Well, yeah, it was also one final point. For a while, the Biden administration was talking about friendshoring in the context of the CHIPS Act, and then they stopped talking about it for a while because domestic politicians were like, wait a minute, no, we want everything here.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? You're going to help allies build things? But then right after the CHIPS Act was passed, they went back to friendshoring. So
it's interesting.
it was politically not very appropriate for a little bit. So.
Peter Conley, I'm an undergrad policy. I was curious, it definitely seems like it's one of the events like more advanced chips. I was wondering, has there been a way to discriminate on the chip manufacturing equipment that goes to advanced chips, especially software, the EA software, and also are there ways to discriminate on the inputs to the chip production, or is those kind of ubiquitous enough that it's hard to really restrict the manufacturing equipment to advanced chip?
Yeah, so for the U.S. government, as they've been watching this, one of the concerns that they've expressed to us is that China is building a lot of chip production, and in other areas, if you look at where China's invested a lot of state capital, shipbuilding, steel, aluminum, 5G communications equipment, solar, it's created non-market oversupply, so that when the government says thou shalt build 50 chip factories or 50 shipbuilding shipyards, they're not thinking about the market, they're not thinking about profit and loss. They flood the market, it puts pressure on producers in other countries, and what happens is everybody goes out of business and China captures like 70-80% of all that production. And then strategically, those nations become more dependent on China for production. And so I think what the U.S. government is concerned about is that might happen again in semiconductors. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to do because semiconductor manufacturing is not solar manufacturing. It's night and day in terms of the difference in complexity. And as you pointed out, it depends on the manufacturing process, hundreds of different sets of precision tools, dozens of different types of specialty gases and chemicals that are at 99.9999% purity. Only like one company in the world in Japan can produce. And so what the U.S. government has done with these rules has said two things. The most advanced tools required for the most advanced chip production, they have banned for export to China. So for example, the most advanced photolithography machine is only made, it's the basically process of taking light and then using that. Think about when you expose film, use light to expose photoresist to create the patterns on the semiconductor wafer, all those transistors. Those machines are about $200 million a piece. They're bigger than this room. They have the world's most powerful lasers, pulsing molten tin that drops at 10,000 drops per second, that refracts through 50 different lenses, and then explodes into plasma that lights it up and creates these etching little patterns on the wafer that are about 40,000 times smaller than human hair, and they do billions of them at about 300 wafers per hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and picometer level stability, zero temperature control, complete vacuum tube. I mean, it's the world's most complex tool on the face of the earth. And they're produced by one company in the Netherlands, which is called ASML. And that's a spinoff of Philips in the Netherlands. It's amazing they've really been able to do this. And they too have a global innovation network, supply chain. They do this in partnership, the national labs in Japan. Anyways, so the Trump administration put pressure on the Dutch government to block the export of that tool to China in 2019. And so that's required for 5 nanometer chip production. That's already been restricted to China. And then what the US government did in 2020 is they put China's largest chip producer, which is known as Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, SMIC, on the entity list, which is the US government's blacklist. But they said technology below 10 nanometer, so tooling or that tool that's specific to 10 nanometer couldn't be exported to China. And then they just changed it to 14 and they applied it to all factories in China. So they haven't really taken a tool-by-tool approach. They've just said if exporters in the U.S. are exporting that equipment to a company in China that's producing anything below these lines and thresholds, then that export is prohibited. They need to get a license. And time will only tell if this will be effective. Much of that equipment can also be produced in Japan by Japanese companies or in the Netherlands or in South Korea. And right now, they're not supporting the U.S. government in this action. It's a unilateral action. And so the concern is that those Chinese companies, U.S. government, does not want to produce chips. They just go out and buy the equipment from Japan and do the same thing. And that actually hurts the U.S. company at the same time. So it's like a double loss for the United States. They haven't achieved their national security goal, and they've let out market share to foreign competitors. And the U.S. government right now is trying to undertake a diplomatic initiative to get Japan and the Netherlands to join that in sort of a trilateral export control arrangement. If that were actually to be realized, that would be more like a very, very difficult barrier for those companies in China to overcome. Now, China's not just sitting by and they're getting pummeled every day and saying, "Oh, that's good with us." No, they're very, there's a lot of anxiety over this. It's kind of seen as a blockade against them, economic warfare, really. And you can see in the party Congress, Xi Jinping has said, technology self-sufficiency, national security, the ability to carry out a struggle against Western blockades and export controls. And so this is really an area where I think increasingly China is probably going to fight back in some way, whether it's in rare earths, whether it's in denying access to their market, because they have things that we want too. So far, we've been denying them access to a lot of things. And at some point, back to no corner, I feel like China will start denying things that we need too. Two can play that game, I think, in restrictions and zero-sum decoupling that too.
Okay. Did you have a question or? Are you sure?
Oh, actually, no. So this is
Ask your question.
No, I think that the answer to the previous question was also related to my question, but thank you so much for coming down.
Yeah.
This is actually the third part of a series on semiconductors, and the second part, the lecture before was on the European Chips Act,
Mhm.
and in that talk, the speaker talked about some kind of creating a transatlantic semiconductor ecosystem, and so that suggesting that there might be some synergy between the EU Chips Act and the US Chips Act. And in your talk earlier, there wasn't much mention specifically about European partners, except for the one that you just talked about in the Netherlands. And I was just wondering if you could comment more on how the US can work to create this kind of not really blockade, but I guess this ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Europe has several strengths in the semiconductor ecosystem. Equipment, as I've already mentioned, are very strong. In research to develop it, some of the leading research labs in the semiconductor industry doing pre-competitive research, which means this is research done in a lab 4 companies have really commercialized it. There's no immediate return on investment, and governments in Belgium and in France and Italy have funded, and in Germany, the Fraunhofer Institutes have funded this type of innovation where the government basically writes the initial check, and if it's promising, 2 or 3 years down the road, the industry will take it and commercialize it. It's kind of the government playing an incubating role. And Belgium is an organization called IMEC, funded by the Belgian government in partnership with the private sector. The French Atomic Agency, CEA, in Grenoble has a big semiconductor research lab, and then the Fraunhofer Institutes. And I think there's a hope that maybe there could be a partnership around research development. As the U.S. is trying to build similar facilities, like a National Semiconductor Technology Center, there's a hope that maybe the U.S. can partner. On the industry side, Europe is about 10% of the semiconductor market, so it's about a quarter of the size of the U.S. semiconductor industry. It's relatively small, but they're still strong for that small share they have. They specialize in analog semiconductors, so they're big companies, Infineon, ST, Microelectronics, NXP, tend to do that embedded semiconductor business. So they're very strong in the semiconductors for autos, industrial equipment, medical devices. That's really where European companies shine because that's where their industry is strong. Think about the German auto companies, the medical device firms, robotics like ABB and others. So there's a hope that there could be cooperation maybe with Europe around that trailing edge semiconductor technology, semiconductors for auto innovation. But the top priorities again are coordination on export control. That's really where I think the U.S. government is focusing. On also research development is another area, and then standards and workforce is another area where Europe is very strong in standard setting, and there's a hope that there could be some collaboration. Now there's this new group between the U.S. and the EU called the Trade and Technology Council. It's led by the Commerce and Trade representative in the U.S. government, and then the EU Commission out of Brussels. They're actually meeting in first week of December, and they're talking about how can the U.S. and the EU collaborate to have a robust system where technology standards can be set in a way that's free from government influence. So it's really talking about China. Because even for the semiconductor industry, whoever can write the standard kind of leads the technology ecosystem, and then everyone builds their technology around yours. Think about that dang Apple charger. Because they lead that standard, it's actually an Intel chip that does the Apple charger, but they lead that standard, everyone has to build everything around them. And that's really seen as a key ability for sort of, the U.S. Western ecosystem to maintain its competitiveness. But that was a great question. They also have their own CHIPS Act, the EU, 43 billion euros, but it has not been passed yet. But at the member state level, they actually don't have to wait for the Commission or the Parliament to approve it. And Germany, Spain have already started allocating grants to U.S. and European companies, but on a much smaller basis compared to the United States.
You're next, but I'll just add to Jimmy's point that the EU is a totally different policymaking environment. They do not have responsibility for national security issues. Yeah. And even on the export control issues where there would need to be consultation with the EU, there is more likely to be handled in individual markets. So, and the EU is much more comfortable with giving industries money to grow than the U.S. has historically been. So it's definitely partner on the technology front, but it's coming to it from a slightly different perspective.
Well, and also on the export control front with Europe, it's a very sensitive topic. I mean, many of the U.S. export control rules are extraterritorial, meaning that U.S. law applies to a German factory because that German factory has a U.S. piece of manufacturing equipment in it or software somehow that's coming from the United States. And what the U.S. export controls have said in many cases is if using anything from the United States, you could be in Iceland producing chips or in Antarctica. That's subject to U.S. law because the stuff inside your factory was produced in the United States. That's how the U.S. government reached around the world to restrict chips going to Huawei. And they've done this again on October 7 with the new rules on the AI chips. And Europe is very sensitive to sort of U.S. government reaching in and regulating sovereign European markets. They've been resistant to this type of action. And previously, the U.S. government in the Biden administration, under the Trade and Technology Council, said, we will not impose extraterritorial controls without consultations with Europe. They didn't really do that this time. And they said they consulted, but who knows? My understanding is
Called
pretty
some guy
limited.
in the ministry.
Like the day before.
This is your
Um,
consultation.
Yeah, here's the rule. It's coming out tomorrow. Thank you very much. Which is what they did with us too. We didn't get any advanced consultation on
that's
it either.
interesting also.
It
It emphasizes the national security focus that the industry wasn't consulted. That's
yeah, the government really believes that in some, why show it to an industry if the industry doesn't like it?
interesting too.
Um,
Okay. And again, a shift, you guys, definitely a shift. You've had your hand up since the beginning, so you go next. I think we have this room for 15 more minutes, so go ahead.
I'm a graduate student from Stanford. Thank you so very much for that wonderful insights on different virtual semiconductors. I just want to listen to your thoughts on the role that India is trying to play in the semiconductor manufacturing with Semicon, $10 billion incentive package that they've released for corporate investment. I think Foxconn has recently announced a $20 billion factory in China as well. I do have another question as well. It seems like both Trump administration and Biden administration are trying their level best to maintain that leverage in semiconductor industry. Could you consider this as a bipartisan issue? And if it is a bipartisan issue, is there some kind of difference in their approach?
Yeah, those are two really great questions. So India, I was actually just there last month and then in April, specifically to try and understand and see how we can partner with India in the semiconductor space. In fact, the Modi government has just rolled out their version of the CHIPS Act. So Korea has a national K-Belt semiconductor strategy. The EU has a CHIPS Act. Japan has a CHIPS Act. Mexico, even Canada is coming together with a CHIPS Act. It's a little bit smaller than the US one, but India is actually one of the bigger programs. And India has a huge, I think, opportunity. Already, about 80,000 engineers work for US semiconductor and European firms in India already. India is already doing a lot of the chip design, research, and engineering. When I was in India, a lot of the 5G base station chips are being designed in India for global companies. And I think India's hope is that they can not just help other companies design and produce chips, but produce some on their own. And that's a very noble and important goal. The challenge that I think India has is they have this great incentive package, $10 billion, but the rest of the regulatory environment is not quite there yet. So ease of doing business. For example, when you're importing and exporting products to come into a factory, you might have to wait a week to get customs approval. Everywhere else, it's click of a mouse and it's done. So that kind of thing, I think India will figure it out because they're very determined to get this done. I think India can play an important role in trailing edge mature chip production. Also, assembly, test, and packaging is the final stage of chip production. And then continuing to grow its role in research development. When I was there, Qualcomm just announced hiring 9,000 people in India over the next year. We have one company that just shut down their research development office in Asia in a certain country and is moving it to India. So I think the growth in India is really unmatched. I mean, you have hundreds of millions of people under the age of 30 who are eager for really good, high-paying jobs. It's a major
And
opportunity.
highly educated.
Highly educated, yeah.
So I see that we're starting to have churn. So what I'm gonna, because folks need to go to class, I know. What I'm gonna suggest is Jimmy has a little bit of time now. If you wanna come and ask him questions individually, you're welcome to. But otherwise, we'll say thank you.
Great questions, yeah.